Hello and welcome. I'm Ann Henderson, the Frist Art Museum Director of Education and Engagement, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today for our Food for Thought first session for Farm to Table. As is our custom at the Frist, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. The Frist Art Museum sits on land the Cherokee and Shawnee Nation peoples, elders, and their ancestors call their homeland. We acknowledge and pay respect to them and offer deep gratitude and respect to the land and water that supports us. Today, we are thrilled to kick off our reimagined Food for Thought program in partnership with Vanderbilt University's Division of Government and Community Relations and the Office of the Vice Provost for Arts, Libraries, and Global Engagement. The Food for Thought interdisciplinary conversations actually began in 2013 and have happily returned today after a 5-year hiatus. We are grateful for Vanderbilt University's collaboration, to their faculty, staff, and our community members for their willingness to share their unique perspectives on our exhibitions. Thank you especially to Vice Provost Tracy Sharpley Whiting, Kathleen Fuchs Ritz, Midori Lockhart, Casey Gimrick, and Claire Campbell for collaborating on these programs with us. And our thanks to Megan Rust, Frist Art Museum Interpretation Director, for coordinating and planning this program for us today. Now, please take time to silence your cell phones, locate your nearest emergency exit, which are back there and over here, and join me in welcoming Claire Campbell, Program Manager for the Vice Provost's Office.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Vanderbilt University, we're really excited to be partnering with the Frist again on Food for Thought. I think our faculty, in addition to community partners and Frist staff, are really excited to discuss with you today, reflecting on these exhibitions and give you something to chew about. And welcoming to the stage now would be Executive Director Seth Feeman.
Here I am. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so thrilled to have you all here, and thank you again for this wonderful partnership. We've been talking about bringing this program back since before I started here, and it's delightful to have it up and running again. So thank you for being here. I'm going to introduce, I asked everyone to come up with me at once so we could not have the awkward moment of me finishing introducing everyone and then having them walk out on stage. So they're here with me now, and I'll introduce them. Farthest from me is Brandon R. Bird. Brandon is a historian of Black intellectual and social history with a special focus on the United States and Haiti. He is the author of The Black Republic, African Americans and the Fate of Haiti, University of Pennsylvania Press 2020, and a co-editor of Ideas in Unexpected Places, Reimagining Black Intellectual History, which is Northwestern University Press 2022. Along with these publications, his scholarship has appeared in journals such as Slavery and Abolition, the Journal of African American History, the Journal of Haitian Studies, Modern Intellectual History, and Diplomatic History, as well as popular outlets including GQ and ESPN's The Undefeated. Next, we have Shakuria Jackson. She has over 10 years of professional culinary experience. She is the chef and owner of Claremont Street Bao and Canvas by Chef Fusion, which provides bespoke dining experiences. At Claremont Street Bao, her menu, I added this to your bio, I hope you don't mind. Her menu includes the 6220 bun, which features Chicago-style fried chicken, and the Korean Town bun, which includes Korean fried chicken, and the PB&J, which I'm going to ask her to describe during our conversation because it sounds like the most delicious fusion delight that could be. Originally from Chicago, she graduated from Johnson & Wales University with a degree in culinary arts. And closest to me, we have Ted Fisher. Ted is the Cornelius Vanderbilt Professor of Anthropology at Vanderbilt University, where he also directs the Institute for Coffee Studies. He founded an award-winning social enterprise in Guatemala to combat malnutrition, and he advises the World Health Organization on behavioral and cultural insights. He has written extensively on food, economics, and value. His most recent book is Making Better Coffee: How Maya Farmers and Third-Wave Tastemakers Create Value, and that's University of California Press, 2022. Let's welcome them here, please. So before we get started with questions, I'm going to do a balancing trick here. Before we get started with questions, I wanted to introduce to you all the exhibitions that we currently have on view that are related in various ways to the conversations that we will have today. Our primary focus is going to be on one of the three shows, but as you'll hear when we talk, there are some important relationships between all three of them. So the first exhibition that we have on view is organized by the American Federation of Arts and the Chrysler Museum of Art, called Farm to Table. It focuses on late 19th century France and features the work of artists such as Rosa Bonheur, Gustave Courbet, Paul Gauguin, Claude Monet, and Camille Pissarro. Oops. It's running away from me, too. All of these artists captured the nation's unique relationship with food as a foundation of national identity, and that's a topic that we'll get into quite a bit. It includes 60 works that portray beautiful harvests, bustling farmers markets, people eating and enjoying and making food, both humble and luxurious affairs. We also presented Tennessee Harvest in partnership with the Tennessee State Museum. It extends the themes of Farm to Table, but focuses much more on local history by highlighting paintings made here in Tennessee or by Tennesseans traveling elsewhere. The project includes 16 works by 19th and early 20th century painters, and for some reason it keeps jumping ahead. I'll put it down and see if that prevents it from happening. It includes 16 works by 19th and 20th century painters who absorbed and adapted European approaches to agrarian subject matter and painting styles, and we will talk quite a bit about adaptation and borrowing in our conversation as well. Further highlighting the local, I will encourage you all to take the audio tour that is a part of these two exhibitions. The audio tour includes many members of Nashville's own diverse food community who we brought in to reflect on individual works. This includes representatives from Bloomsbury Farms, the Nashville Food Project, Second Harvest Food Bank, and some restaurateurs and chefs. So it is a real delight. Third, we have M. Florine Demosthenes and Didier William, What the Body Carries. This show offers a selection of figurative paintings, collages, and sculpture that, I was just checking, I thought it was getting away from me again, that explore how these two artists occupy spaces outside of Haiti while still being informed by the country's cultural and spiritual traditions. There are formal connections that are shared by these artists that include an emphasis on a motif of eyes and the use of paired figures, a reference to voodoo's divine twins. And the artists use these to express the visibility and duality of their experience growing up both in Haiti and in the United States. There are some rich dialogues between these shows, and I hope that we'll be able to touch on them quite a bit as we go along. So, I wanted to start here. The image on your left is probably the most iconic work in the exhibition. It is a Monet haystack. And then opposite it, we have a Dupre image of a gatherer of hay. And for me, this show brings up questions, while it is fundamentally about food, the questions seem fundamentally also about national identity and the creation of national identity. And when we were talking before we got together to be here today, I was speaking with the panelists about this term that shows up throughout this exhibition called terroir. Terroir is a French term that means land or soil, maybe, but it has a lot of other implications about the kind of flavors that get imbued into food. So terroir could be what gives grapes a certain kind of flavor. It comes up a lot in agricultural terminology. But terroir also has a lot to do with national or local pride. And so that's sort of where I wanted to start, was this question of how food shapes our sense of local identity. And I'll start by opening it up to anyone who wants to jump in, and then I'll pepper you with more specific questions.
So your question is how food shapes, go
Yeah,
ahead.
I'm curious. So I'd love to hear you specifically talk about what makes Chicago food Chicago food. A lot of the images in this show are really investing in claiming that certain kinds of food are really French. And so what does that mean in the context of your food practice? When you say that you've got Chicago-style food or that you're drawing on Chicago inspiration, how does that appear in your culinary work?
So pretty much what makes Chicago food is the immigrants and the ethnicities that migrated into Chicago and formed these communities, and it happened all organically. So where I grew up off of Devon and Western, and it's predominantly an Indian and Pakistani community, but it's theirs, right? And me being able to partake and, indulge in their culture and, eat their food and help it become a part of my culture. That's what it means to be Chicago influenced, from deep dish pizza, Italian beef, pizza puffs. Those things are staples of Chicago, and that becomes a part of you because you know that you can go to the corner and get you something from the back of the store. You can go to your neighborhood deli and get you a sandwich for $5. So I think all of those things play a role into, and the influence into your culture. So I guess I'm a piece of everything, Italian, Indian, Mexican, just a little bit of everything. So yeah.
I'm going to ask you a question. So I have to whisper because my voice is so loud, and in a microphone it'll be overwhelming. So there's a comfort to that, is sort of what you're saying. There's a familiarity and a comfort. You can just go down to the corner and get a food that you like and that means something.
Yes.
But it's not coming from but the food that's associated with the place came from all over the world.
Right, exactly. So it's basically they, once you come over to somewhere and they don't have the things or, that you're used to back home, you have to make do with what you have around you. So, a lot of, immigrants that migrated over there, even my grandmother, she's from Mississippi. During the Great Migration, she took a lot of her southern roots to Chicago. Did she have access to okra and all those things back like we do in the South? No. So she had to make do with what she had.
Yeah, it makes me think about some of these paintings that a lot of the foods that we associate with Europe in national identity are also brought over, right? Potatoes in Ireland or potatoes in Germany, potatoes in all of Northern Europe. My wife is German and she constantly laments the potato selection in Nashville. Tomatoes in Italy and all of these things. And so while they're they're often presented as kind of timeless, right? Like this is French food or this is Italian food.
Right.
It's all been mashed together at some point.
Yes, exactly. You're exactly right.
Yeah, Ted, that's the thought that exactly occurred to me and as y'all were talking. I think as we go along, we're going to see some images potentially of desserts and sort of cuisines that are associated with French national identity and sort of assumed to be classically French, or even in the rhetoric of this era, presented explicitly as classically French. But of course, those are sweets that are heavy on chocolate, that use vanilla, that use sugar, so those are all reliant on colonial exports, right? And by this era, and I think we'll get more into this, this is a reformulation of empire, right? So those colonial exports have been immersed and integrated in the French cuisine for decades and decades and decades and centuries by that point. Those are related to an earlier era of French imperialism dating back to the 16th century. So to this conversation, the question is, how do those things just become sort of naturalized? And as the foods become naturalized, how do some of the processes by which those foods emerge, how do those sort of become submerged or even, this isn't a word I don't think, invisibilized.
The meaning is clear.
Thank you.
No, go ahead.
Well, we're going to get to some of these questions in more depth because there's some additional images. What I want to make sure that I, as the art historian here, draw your attention to is in the context of this exhibition in particular, you pointed out there's a historical context in which the paintings, predominantly paintings, are being made in this exhibition, and it is, as you rightly said, it is the reemergence of colonial formation and reestablishment of nationhood after a punishing defeat by the Prussians. So the Prussians and France are in a war. 1871, France loses horribly, and they're effectively starving. In Paris, people are literally starving, and some of the works in the show that I'm not going to put on the screen because we've just had lunch.
Wanted to put them on the screen.
I did really want to put them on the screen. Deal with people cooking things that are maybe unsavory because they're hungry. They're complaining that I didn't put them up now. But the artists who are making work in this time seem heavily invested in claiming the Frenchness of the food that they're depicting. And the Monet is a perfect example of that, because if you look closely at the image, it is a haystack, and it is a haystack that is assembled in the same way that a haystack would have been created a century earlier, or even 2 centuries earlier. But Monet, in his interest in showing the kind of beauty and immediacy, is also giving it pride of place. It's this monumental structure, and it is the core, it is the potato of France. It is the foundation of the entire agroeconomy. And he is, whether intentionally or not, he is associated in this painting with the mountains. It's timeless. It is like the forever food of France. And so I'm so interested with your response about like what is quintessentially Chicago, and like all of it is not timeless from that place. Most of what makes Chicago Chicago food is a blending, a hybridity of these things that come from other places and have been kind of fused or brought together. And that's something that I think we can talk about more with some of the additional images that we've got here. So this is a good comparison, showing you Renoir's depiction of a banana field from Algeria. So immediately we get to the question of colonization. And I wonder if you might elaborate a little bit more on Brandon, on what you were talking about at this moment in French history.
Yeah, for sure. So I suppose to take it a step back, and even to go to the previous image, one thing I'm struck by is the agrarian nature, of this image, the rural setting, the perhaps ways that reflects even subconsciously some of the responses to industrialization, to urbanization, and the responses to that, all across, the quote unquote West, including, close to home right here in the United States. So that strikes me, that she's producing, that it's producing not just for a local market, but producing ostensibly for the nation, if you will, like you could read that in. And conversely, in the other scene, the colonial scene, there's nobody, right? There's nobody producing. Whatever goods you can read into that are, just sort of occurring naturally, right? Without, labor, without hands on it, right? Who is producing the nation? It's a hardworking peasantry at home. It's also a specific worker. It is not an industrial worker that is, potentially problematic. Who is not producing? Well, explicitly, the colonies are, they're doing some things. They're providing a visual, reference points. But we see something very different in this image. And this is a reading coming not from a art historian, but just a regular old historian, right? So to me, when I look at these images and juxtapose that, and to Seth, your question, it fits with the era. The French invent civilization. That word that's a French invention, right? So this is the era of Third Republic in France, in which the civilizing mission, so in French that's mission civilisatrice, that becomes official imperial doctrine. And of course, every nation, imperial nation, is going to have some sort of similar guiding principle. But in France, it's elevated to official doctrine, right? And as part of that doctrine, like mastery is very central to it. And that's mastery not just of peoples, but of the landscape as well, too. So when I see, again, these images juxtaposed, it fits in with that. That's, what's happened in the hexagon at home, that is, that's a place of civilization. It's a place of productivity. And what happens in the colonies, that is a pre-modern place. That is a primitive place. That's a place to be tamed. That's a place to be quite literally civilized.
You're so right to focus on that, and the images really bear that out. You're right to seize on the Renoir and say what's not depicted there is the realities of labor. That in the other image you saw a woman working, although that is also a very sanitized labor. She's smiling, she's happy, she's doing the national work. In this, labor disappears. What's hidden behind this image, though, is that it's also evidence of agroscience at work. So when this colonization was happening, the reason why this is so wild looking, why it's so dense with trees, is because it was a scientific planting farm where they're experimenting with how much bounty can they extract from the land in a manageable way. So they planted the trees effectively really close together so they could build up this resource. And I'm wondering how science plays into each of what you do, agroscience, scientific advents in culinary work, because it's part of the colonial story. It's also part of the how we create Chicago identity. Those things are all wrapped up together.
Yeah, we're debating among ourselves who will go first. The science question of it, of course, that is part of the civilizing mission that Brandon was talking about, sort of making this wild world into our image, and efficiency and productivity and profitability. And there is a horribly dark underside to that Brendan alluded to. There's also, I think it's important to point out, an attraction to that as well. More food. If we can produce more food for more people. So there's a tension between these two things, I think, in the civilizing project. I wanted to say two things. I'm going to go back to something Brandon said just really quickly. There's also, it's interesting, the distinction between the pictures, the images in the show in the cafes and the one of the woman that you were talking about, right? And I think when you were talking about the civilizing mission, I was thinking about all those guys, mostly in the cafes, and not these people, right? So there were sort of two Frances going on at the same time. Let me mention just one other thing about, to connect this to terroir and the agricultural science of it. Terroir is super important in French. It's a French word, Bordeaux and Champagne and Brie and all of these things, terroir comes from that. But the closer you look, like any border or boundary, right, the blurry it becomes. There's no scientific basis why at this line, this wine on this side tastes great like Bordeaux, and this wine on the other side of this line doesn't, right? I mean, the soils don't change dramatically like that. And so it underlines Brandon's point about these being political projects, masquerading as agricultural and culinary.
Shakri, I wonder if you could talk a little about this from a food perspective in particular. And I mentioned your menu, and I think this would be a good moment because there is something, there's something in the colonial enterprise, there are lots of things in the colonial enterprise which are horrific and terrifying and brutal. And there are things about access to materials and cultures that can be quite beautiful at the same time. And when I mentioned the bao buns, I mentioned two styles of fried chicken, and I mentioned the PB&J, and I think there is something to be celebrated about fusion and where these different terroirs are being drawn from. And I wonder if you could just talk about the menu a little bit.
So a little bit about my menu. Pretty much, that's a good question to Seth. I just like to think that, drawing influences and just to dab a little bit into like the fusion in that sense, as to why my menu is the way it is and as to why, how I come up with these things. I think it's all about like experience, and also like when you kind of like work with different backgrounds and different cultures and different ethnicities, you kind of pick up a little bit like along with like their elements and way of cooking, like the PB&J. He wants to dive into that. So it's not peanut butter and jelly bao. It's a pork belly, kimchi jam, a peanut sauce, peanut furikake, and shredded carrots. Y'all saying, ooh, you know what I mean? Like, so, and it just a little bit of like the science and the madness behind that was just like, honestly, it was just me taking everything that I've learned throughout my culinary journey, and taking like kimchi jam, for instance. We all know that kimchi is fermented. The reason why is because, shelf life, it lasts longer, but also it tastes good as well. But during my man, I'm like, can this be made into a jam? Those are like the questions that I ask myself. And that's just how I came up with it. I don't know, Seth. Like, it's experience. I mean, it's a madness to you experiment with these different foods, and you just wonder, like, would this taste good? And that's just what I did, like, and it did. I don't know. The same thing with pork belly. Pork in Asian culture is very, very significant. It's cheap. Two, it goes a long way, and it's accessible. And I knew that I had to pay, homage to them, and it's a staple in the bun as well, by utilizing that. So. Yeah, I just guess it's experience. I don't know. I hope that answered the question, Seth.
Can I ask a follow-up question? So are you thinking just about the flavors when you're doing this, or are you also thinking about like the culture? It's like, hey, this would be cool to mash up these two cultures.
I'm thinking about both. So the flavors and the culture. I'm being careful to not appropriate and appreciate, because there's a fine line, right? So when you look at me, I'm African American, I'm doing bao, which is an Asian staple, right? So I'm also being, walking on that fine line of like, okay, not to appropriate, but to appreciate. And the way I appreciate it is by still paying homage, but also adding my own flair to it, right? So I'm also thinking about the flavors, like what would taste good, what would mesh well. So yeah, I pretty much.
I don't think in all the years that I've been in my intellectual work been struggling with the concept of the balance between appropriation and honoring. I've never heard somebody so clearly state that making a contribution is how you avoid appropriation, that like adding something to it is the way to avoid just taking, is that you're putting something into the story, you're putting something into the world from your own experience.
Exactly. And just, giving people a little background of the origin of it. I think that helps. A lot of time when people appropriate something, they make it seem as if they came up with this out of a whim, or, like it's theirs. They put a stamp on it. And it's something that's been going on for centuries, for years. So the way to avoid that is to educate yourself on like, okay, where did this start? How did this start? Why did they do it? A lot of the foods that we enjoy today were survival for a lot of people, things that we enjoy, like oxtail is one. It's a delicacy. It's super expensive now, but back then it was scraps, So now you see everyone, fusing it and doing different things with it, making oxtail egg roll, oxtail pasta. But back then it was a way of survival. I think food back then was like the value was in labor versus the actual product, whereas now you're seeing the value is also in the labor but also the products, because now like chitterlings, I don't know, it's the pig intestines, but chitterlings, they're super expensive, but back then it was considered scraps. So, and it's a lot of labor that goes into peeling chitterlings. I mean, I peeled them to 6 in the morning with my grandma, and it smells really bad, but it's a lot of labor that goes into it. So the value was in the labor, whereas now you see it kind of like neck to neck, So.
Would you do one of your pop-ups in Seoul or Beijing? Would that be a cool thing?
I mean, that would be a cool thing. That would be a cool thing. It is something I'll look forward to. Collaborating with them over, that'd be a cool thing to look into for sure.
So we're gonna get back to the colonial question in a minute when we look at some images that involve things like coffee and sugar more specifically. Before we get there, I wanted to talk about this other space. We talked about sort of the metropole, the kind of center of France, and we've talked about the colonial work. But there's also these mixing zones. There are these other spaces, and this is an image of a market. I love this image. It is like, it shows all the chaos of what's happening at a vegetable market. It is like overflowing with stuff. There's incident everywhere. There's vegetable scraps on the ground. There are dogs playing. There are people from various walks of life who are encountering one another, which I think is key. And it's also presented, and this seems pretty intentional by the artists, in a way that the chaos of the scene is contained by the architecture beyond it, which gives it a kind of structure, a kind of regularity, a kind of control over what could be a very, maybe dangerous is too extreme of a word, but it's a place where people are mixing in a society where that is not appreciated. And so within the bounds of historic architecture, there is this way of saying, this is okay right here, it's safe to do this right here. And so I wonder if you could talk about the marketplace as a site for some of the some of the topics that we were discussing before about colonial work in particular. But I'm also curious for you, like, what happens at the market? Like, you have kimchi sitting on your shelf and you're like, I'm gonna make this into jam. Like, what kind of creative inspiration is happening when you're at in a space like this where, there's a feast of raw material effectively that you can get creative with. So maybe we could start with you, and then I want to open it up to a bigger question. Like, what do you do when you go to a market? What are you looking for? What's your experience of like just going to a farmer's market and exploring? How are you making decisions?
When I go to, it's like I'm a kid in the candy store when I go to a farmer's market. You start to see what goes through my mind is, and I'm going to touch a little bit on accessibility. Is that where I grew up in Chicago? Well, I grew up in rougher parts. Fresh fruit and fresh vegetables, farmers market weren't entirely accessible to me. So when once I became a chef and, my palate developed, now I have the advantage of being in the farmer's market, and I'm like, I could buy that, I get this, what? Some lemon basil, oh my God. It's like a kid in the candy store. So I take all of these things in. I'm like, how can I mix this? I smell it, I taste it, and I talk to the farmers, and they give me their feedback, and this pairs well with this. So that is how I kind of take it in, because again, where I'm from, that's not accessible in certain neighborhoods. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Can you all talk a little bit about this as like the boundary, the kind of colonial boundary? Because there's so much work invested in the colonial project of separating out a kind of sanitized space and the colony of far away and near, but the market is a place where there's a bit of a permeable membrane. And I wonder if you could talk about that, or maybe you could talk specifically about some of the social enterprise work that's related to that from your practice. I'm inviting both of you, but I did cue you up.
I was queuing you up. Brandon, do you want to go first? It would be best for me.
So, part of what I'm struck by and why I'm taking another look is that, absolutely, the market, ostensibly is a place where that boundary will be permeable. I'm not sure that I see colonial products represented here.
Good point.
Yeah, but I could be missing that. But if I'm not, then that's notable as potentially intentional, potentially subconscious. But either way would perhaps speak to exactly what you pointed out as an impulse to distinguish between the metropole and overseas, and that distinction occurs at a cultural level, in literature and in all aspects of life. Occurs in literal the language used to refer to different places, geographical place names, and it seems to be occurring here. Again, I may be missing something, so somebody else picks up on it. But there's certainly cabbage. There's what else do we have here? But conspicuously absent are mangoes. Right.
So I really appreciate that observation. I love that you're doing close looking. Thank you. But I also feel like part of the colonial project is work of classification within the metropole. And so that may be more apparent here, is that there's a labor distinction, there's a class distinction. What's interesting is saying that there are spaces that were inaccessible for you, that were not in proximity. There's a kind of different thing happening here about proximity being made, where farmers are bringing their products to market that may be nationally based or regionally based food, but they're standing next to next, they're potentially haggling with people who are representatives of a different order of society. And so there is this other project this other element of what is a much more complex colonial project.
I like your emphasis on categories there. I think that's really important. But since Brandon opened the door to sort of answering a slightly different question than you asked, I'm going to follow his lead. And what I was thinking about with the permeability in this image, but also in a lot of the images in the show, just that visceral materiality of a connection with the food, the butchering the lamb, the sort of getting into the entrails of it, sort of what you were talking about too in the farmer, sort of touching this stuff, which is so far removed. I mean, we're moving back now slightly, right, with the growth of farmers markets and farm-to-table cuisine and all of that. But something north of 60% of U.S. calories consumed today come from packaged and ultra-processed foods. And I'm struck by this sort of close visceral relation. It also made me think about it when I was going through the Williams portion of the Haiti show. It sort of looks like people, to me, there were like people coming up from the earth. And those earlier romanticized visions of farmers, it's sort of that connection, their hands are in the dirt or the woman is gathering together things. And I think it's something that we collectively feel like we have lost, right? And are trying to get back in touch with these days.
Quick point, but something that you keep returning to seems to be a point worth really emphasizing. Like, you began with a question about, the relationship of food to national identity, but of course what you're getting at too is the relationship between national identity to regional identity and how food connects to that. And of course that raises another tricky set of questions too about, to elevate a national cuisine that has the potential to elevate certain regional cuisines, given that imprimatur of approval, while also times, and here I'm taking us out of the French context and, taking us more to a U.S. context and also taking us out of, this specific, context of the artwork, but has the chance, to devalue other regional cuisines. And there I'm speaking explicitly about the U.S. South. Yeah. At least in my estimation, how that plays out in conversations, and especially not only what is a national cuisine, but what is like elevated in, like new American restaurants and that type of deal.
Chef? I'm hoping that you could talk to this question, because it is something that I was wondering, maybe putting that in a little bit of a different framework, is when you were describing kind of what is Chicago cuisine right now, I'm going to step in it here, but like what makes Chicago cuisine not St. Louis cuisine? What makes it not, what gives it that sense of, because that's sort of what's happening here. There are all these claims to regional identity. These artists are invested in both identifying what makes something like very specifically from their region, from their space, but also national. And so, like, are you seeing that in the culinary world, that like Chicago is really claiming like, well, this is kind of ours, and like New York has that and it's not ours and we don't want it? Yeah.
It's how you make it, honestly. When something's it's gonna always taste better. So and now you're starting to see Chicago cuisine like kind of trickle elsewhere, throughout the United States. But I think what makes it that is just like the people, and how it came about, the history of why and how it came about. I think that's what makes it that, versus when you go somewhere else, it's just they're duplicating that, or what they think it is, or how they, took a trip to Chicago and, I tried that once, let me take it back home, and let me try to duplicate that, without understanding the whole process behind why it became, that type of food. Yeah.
Yeah, can I build on that?
Ted.
So, I mean, people often ask how, and some version of that question, how place makes this cuisine. Why is Chicago food Chicago? But hearing you, it makes me think, like, how this coming together of all these different cuisines makes the place.
Right. Okay.
Rather than the other way around. And that's always unique in a different, Nashville has a unique coming together of cuisine, Chicago.
Right. Like Nashville hot chicken. I mean, when you go elsewhere, it tastes a little different because, I think people try to make food based upon like the palate of, where they are. So Californian cuisine, and, you got New York, they know what New York's like, people in New York like. So they'll try to add that flair into it. So I think that's what also kind of set things apart.
But you push the limits of that, right? You're having to educate, so it's a back and forth. It's like what they might accept, and I can kind of tempt them with, and then
exactly
you lead them down the path.
Yes, exactly. Kind of lure them in. Yeah.
I'm going to move on to this image. So this is where things get even more interesting to me. This is a painting by an artist who he made his name by painting battle scenes, war imagery, and in this instance, and a couple of other examples, he turned his focus on a table, a dinner. After the dinner is over, everyone's left, and it's sort of the remains of the meal, which to me seems significant that, art historians have the liberty of reading way too much into things, but this is after the battle, this is after the war is done, but in fact it shows great evidence of what some of the colonial enterprise was involved in, including, you referenced before, sugar. There's sugar cubes front and center. It's a little blurry. Coffee's probably been consumed here. There might be chocolate on the table. There are fruits from other places. So I wonder if you can elaborate more, Brandon, on some of what you see in this image, what's going on with it.
Yeah, for sure. So I'll say one thing I'm struck by is, again, that I guess the word that comes to mind is normalization and how that comes about. Certainly if you look, it's 1876 when it's painted. If you look a century or, close to a century before, and you'll see robust abolitionist critiques that center on the consumption of colonial commodities, namely sugar, right? Explicitly saying, your tea, or this would be British abolitionists, especially, but it's across the Atlantic world. So they say your tea or whatever, that is laced with the blood of slaves, right? Because everybody knows that that is where this commodity comes from. It's one place, Saint-Domingue. Again, we look a century earlier, it's producing, the vast majority of sugar and also coffee that enters the European market. So again, everybody knows that. And then, you fast forward, and that's just become such a staple. And it's still a colonial, product. By then, Saint-Domingue, has ceased to exist. Haitians win their independence, but there's other colonies from which, these luxury goods are produced, right? In a way, they cease to become luxuries. They become part of the everyday. So I'm struck by the way that they just become mundane, even as the practices by which they're produced remain fundamentally the same. Please.
And it makes me think, if we can take this, let's pretend this was a century earlier. That works for my purposes better too. The coffee, so it's often attributed by historians that the ideas that led to the Enlightenment were birthed in European coffee houses in Paris, in London, in Amsterdam, and in Hamburg. It was a time when it was a third space, right, as Starbucks likes to call it, that was not a tavern, that was not a gin pub. And so there was a switch from going out and socializing around alcohol to going out and socializing around coffee often mixed with sugar. And so a stimulant that encouraged conversation, and a lot of the ideas about liberty and freedom and capitalism and democracy and science emerged from that context. But what Brandon just underlined is the fundamental irony of that was all fueled by slave labor. All of these ideas about individual rights and autonomy were fueled by in Haiti and other places. And it also, if I could talk about, coffee is my thing, so I can talk about coffee for forever. But coffee, when it was introduced, first as a luxury good, native to Ethiopia. It's one of those products that many people associate today with Latin America, but of course it's native to East Africa. And when it first started getting introduced, it not only stimulated these Enlightenment ideas, but was very explicitly used in early factories to feed workers. It was a cheap way, one anthropologist calls it a proletarian hunger killer. Caffeine, tea or coffee combined with sugar, it's cheap, it gives them energy, they're kind of empty calories, but it keeps them going for a little while longer. Krupp, which was in the early 1800s the largest factory in Germany, today I guess we know partly for coffee machines, but they would give away coffee to their workers and they would sell them coffee to take home at cost, and that was not a philanthropic endeavor.
Yeah, I think it's sort of the, I hate to do this because the works in the show, I think, ought to be appreciated for what is such, in many cases, overwhelming beauty. And this is an example of that, this table setting. It's a monumental painting. It is glorious to behold. The way that the light glints off the silver is unquestionably beautiful. And yet, embedded in it is a pretty harrowing story. And there's a context, too, that, this is painted 5 years after the Great Starvation. So it is a claim of abundance. But the only way that claim of abundance could exist was because of other things that are not included in the scene, or at least not directly included in the scene. So in some ways, it's a very sad image. Even while it is just overwhelmed with this kind of beauty and excitement and energy. I would love, in the few minutes that we have left, to open it up to there are like a million other slides, because I would like to have this conversation all day, because there's a lot to unpack here, but I would really love to invite people here to raise your hand. We have somebody with a mic who will come over and you could ask your questions.
Hi. So I've loved listening to this discussion, and this is one of my most favorite genres within art. But the piece that I keep sort of hearing you, and I don't mean this cavalierly, dance around is so many of these paintings are social statements, talking about colonialism, social strata. We are truly an agrarian society based on local food sources, which would tailor our palates based on our ability to get those rare commodities from the Orient or the Far East. But it hasn't been front and center in your discussion today, and my question is why?
Yeah, I did too.
Yeah, that's a good question. It seems interwoven. Maybe I'll just add this additional example too, so we could maybe hit the nail on the head. Adding this Courbet painting, and it's a painting that Courbet made when he was imprisoned for being a communard. He was involved in the communist siege of Paris, and this is meant to be a claim to, I guess in some ways, adore the underloved fruits. So they're not, in comparison to the Bellecour, which is this glorious scene of sparkling delight. These are everyday fruits that have been handled. If you see the image up closely, they're bruised. They're not the finest fruit that's been selected from the market. And in many ways, this I think is the way that an artist is laying claim to the value of the everyday, and a term that he didn't have that we would use as a sort of social justice claim by depicting fruit in this way. So I think it's there. I think it's sort of interlaced throughout.
Yeah, and I think it's a great commentary. You're right. These are social commentaries, and these are creating history. These are creating a particular view of history, sanitized in some ways, people left out in other ways. So thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you for being here. As I've listened to all of you, it's interesting because and I'm not sure this is just probably going to be a comment, but you wonder if the artist really had this in mind, all the social contact. Did they just paint it for just the beauty of that table? Because we're interpreting, 100 years ago, what the artist had in the intention of the artist. So when I see paintings, and maybe it's a very narrow view, but I look at the beauty of it. I look at the talent. Yes, you can overlay the social, the brutality, all of that, but I don't know. I just like to enjoy the art for the art piece instead of looking into it so complicating. I don't know. It's just me. I'm just making a comment, not a question.
Thank you for that comment. I think you can and you should enjoy them. These are extraordinarily talented artists who are making beautiful scenes. I think art historians have to use good care here when talking about intention, because there are certain artists who were making intentional statements with the work that they're doing. Some of these artists were personally involved in the National Project. Some of them were involved in the Communards Project. They had specific political and social positions. Others of them may be representing certain political ideas because of their presence within them. And that is the joy of getting to do art history and other forms of history, is that we can extract what might be there and embedded in something that can be enjoyed as pure beauty or may have these sort of latent meanings that we get to enjoy exploring. So I think you get to have it both ways. I think that's the pleasure of getting to do art history. Yeah. Oops. Oh, the one from the interior scene. I don't have that one up. Yeah.
I was really struck by the open market scene from France that we saw earlier, because it reminds me of what I saw in Provence last year. In fact, it's almost identical. The interaction of people, which cuts across classes and brings everybody together. And it's frustrating that we don't have that here in the United States, and I'm wondering how we can get funding or advocate for funding so that this can occur here, beginning with perhaps inner city gardens, so that we can no longer have food deserts.
Yeah, I think we all agree. Everybody up here is murmuring yes. What a difficult moment to start on that project. And there are lots of really neat things going on that way. I think especially Los Angeles, lots of urban gardens. So the movement is there.
I'll just add that our April Food for Thought panel will be looking at the food justice community here in Nashville. So we hope you'll come back for that program. We have another conversation next month as well, where we'll talk more about labor. So lots to dive into with this exhibition. We hope to see you back at our next program. Do we have time for one more question?
I'm going to keep answering that question if I can. I think it's a great way also of building community. I mean, we've been talking about the connection of agriculture and eating to the land, to a particular place. And it's not that that place produces the cuisine, but very often the cuisine produces the place. And I think connecting in the way that you're suggesting has powerful social as well as nutritional benefits.
Thanks for being here, guys. We really appreciate it. My question is about the appearance of abundance. If we're going to be talking about the appearance of abundance, I can't help but think about the appearance of scarcity. These beautiful images of like, look what's available. And I guess I just wanted to hear you all speak about a different type of manipulation, the appearance of it not being available.
Yeah, there is an image in the show that we didn't include in this presentation, but it depicts a young man who is dressed as a chef, rolling up his sleeves. He has his sharp knife out, and he's carving up a rat because it is during the starvation. I actually don't think it delivers what you're asking for, because it is very much a political painting showing how French are overcoming deprivation by being resourceful and treating even an unfine meat as a culinary delicacy. I mean, treating it like he's carving it up the way you would carve up a very fine cut of beef. And it is dressed up, the painting is dressed up in the red, white, and blue of the French flag. And so it really gives you a sense of maybe the opposite of what you're intending. But even in these cases, there's this effort to utilize deprivation as a source of inspiration for national pride. So it is hard to escape that project, I think, in many of the things included here. There are other artists who are, I think, focusing on a different part of that story, sometimes depicted in shows like this, sometimes in other works. It's a good question.
And your question brings to mind a painting that I was asking Seth about, if we had that image here. And actually another one of the Algerian scenes. So there's two scenes set in Algeria in which a relative sparseness, at least to my view, was very apparent. And not only sparseness, but also some other elements, including in the infrastructure, paintings in which walls are depicted with cracks, which is, and it's to the earlier point, it's fair, and I don't know enough about the artists to know all of their politics, but I know enough about the era and the place to understand how these things would have been viewed even by the ordinary Parisian, say. And those were clues into what was widely assumed to be the difference between France and the colonies, and especially North Africa. It's associated with the alleged primitiveness and decline of Muslim countries, right? That scarcity, cracks in walls, infrastructure that was decrepit, right? So that is what your question brought to mind for me, where scarcity is depicted.
Thank you all very much for being a part of this conversation today. Like many of you, I would love to keep it going. I hope that you will come back for future programs like this one. I also hope that you will go in the galleries and maybe see the works of art there in a renewed way. Enjoy them in any way that you please. And please thank you again for joining us.